Welcome to the Fan2Fan Podcast 5 Minute Frights, wherein, give or take 5 minutes, we'll try to share something creepy, kooky, mysterious, spooky, something fun and frightful that you can add to your to-watch queue as we all get ready for Halloween season. My name is Bernie Gonzalez, and on this episode, we have returning Fan2Fan All-Stars Allan and Rebecca, and we're talking about the 1996 slasher directed by Wes Craven, Scream.
Scared, are you?
Someone has taken their love of fear one step too far.
We know you're not the killer.
Solving this mystery.
Everybody's a suspect!
Is going to be murder.
Who are you?
The question is, where am I? We all go a little mad sometimes.
Scream, the new thriller from Wes Craven, rated R.
If there's a Mount Rushmore, Jason, Michael Myers, Freddy, Ghostface kind of chiseled his face somewhere in between like Chucky and Hellraiser and those guys, because it like came out on the scene and made an impression. So do you remember the first time you saw Scream?
I remember that I saw it later than just about everyone else. And so when I watched it, I was kind of like, oh, I get it now. I love it. What are the next ones? Let's watch more of them.
So you were saying like you're kind of a different type of horror fan because, like you said, most of your list is probably more modern horror movies. Yeah. When you first saw Scream, Wes Craven, having done Nightmare on Elm Street, he's kind of referencing himself. So when they start doing the rules, they're kind of going back to like those old school movies from the 80s where they're like, hey, everyone kind of grew up on this, or like you were saying, it went beyond whether you're a horror fan. It's just kind of part of pop culture. So when you saw that stuff in Scream, were you kind of like, yeah, I kind of know this stuff already, even though you weren't like maybe like an old school horror fan?
Yes, I knew them, but I some of the fine-tuned ones I didn't. And I was like, oh, now I got to watch some older things so that I better understand what he's talking about.
Somebody thinks that the original Halloween is overrated. For anyone out there who wants to Aspersia Baby on Twitter and fight her about it.
Driving that bus backwards over your wife there, Allan.
In the last year, and it's not for me. But
I think that's the good thing about Scream is that even if you don't know enough about horror movies in general, like you don't need to know the legacy of horror movies to like enjoy it on its own. It's as much of a comedy as it is a thriller. It's a movie that like my wife, she won't sit down and watch something that's necessarily like a slasher, but she has seen Scream. She has seen Seven. And there's times where I have to kind of remind her, I'm like, well, we saw Sixth Sense and Stir of Echoes. They're almost like more thrillers.
I'm definitely a thriller fan.
Okay.
So it leans a little more towards that. And that's what works for me.
Thriller with some horror sprinkles on top, right?
Exactly. And I don't mind some gore, if it's good gore, if it's necessary gore.
You did start with Jennifer's Body. And from what I remember, there was a lot more gore in that than there was in Scream.
There is, but it's needed. It's needed. And I'm okay with that.
Yeah, let me just add in about Scream. I think that Scream did a couple things. It reinvented the pop-out scare. We think it's over, and then boom, the bad guy is still alive. Like you're never really safe. The killer is never really dead. Kevin Williamson, as much of a hack as he is at the time, he created Dawson's Creek. God damn it! Don't you say anything bad about that man. Like that's where he lost me.
He did go on to make the masterpiece that is I Know What You Did Last Summer. So just saying.
It's also on my list.
Ooh, there we go. We'll be talking about that one.
If he did nothing else for the horror slasher industry, he reinvented that sense of like you're never safe, even in the movie theater.
I will say that opening scene is one of the best done scenes for horror for the last however many years, because it gets everything right about a lot of the horror that I grew up on. But it kind of just, it brought it to the modern audience. there's so much at play there that I thought was really well done. Yeah, I do like scary movies. I'm ready to take any killer that wants to throw a pop quiz my way. I would put my odds at like a 70 to 80% chance of survival.
It's also now you guys got me thinking about this, because a lot of those movies, the 80s slasher films, the thing that kind of takes away the power from them nowadays, if you try to reboot them, like redo them, is cell phones. Because, all right, don't get me wrong. If you're like in Camp Crystal Lake and there's no towers, I get you. But then after a while, you're just going to be like, well, jump in your car and drive until you get reception. What backwards camp doesn't have Wi-Fi? That kind of take things, makes the stakes a little lower, because you're like, well, isn't law enforcement within like a 30-minute call? Like, I just have to survive for like 30 minutes. But like Scream kind of leaned into it, because like you said, Pete, the sensors outside actually using, it was flip phones, but it was phones. Like they were using it as like leaning into it to say, even if you have access to the phones and you could call someone, if somebody was messing with your head and knew enough about you, like even if you had a phone, they could still get to you.
I feel like, the invention of the cell phone really strained, horror writers' brains to try to come up with like the convenient plot machinations to explain why cell phones wouldn't work. I feel like that. I don't know how many there are, but there's always either,
there's a sunspot conveniently on this evening, and I guess we all lost our signal
going on. And I think now they've just found a way to like, well, we're just going to set this movie in the 70s or the 80s and not have to worry about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Or the smart writers like Kevin Williamson, Allan, and Diablo Cody figure out how to kind of like tell an old story in a new way. Both of them kind of go back to like John Hughes, right? Like, hey, like you could tell they grew up watching Ferris Bueller. And they use some of that, the wit that you were talking about. Okay, I wish I had that witty comeback when we had that conversation, but I didn't have it until I was driving home. In their case, their script is like, what if you knew exactly the right thing to say and you were so much smarter? That was a little bit of Scream. Like everyone's a little smarter, but not so smart enough that it wasn't entertaining and still like, yeah, it's still a slasher flick.
Absolutely. And I will say that they did address the cell phone thing in Scream 5. I don't know if you fellas have seen this yet. We went to see Scream 5 and it was...
Is that the new one where they kind of...
New generation, but yes, It was the first Scream movie I saw in theaters.
But it was the cell phone piece of it, they were cloning cell phones. So that way... you thought you were talking to someone who was your friend or like the police, and you were actually talking to the killers.
It's kind of cool how the movie leaned into the original slasher roots and then also evolved with technology, how it played with the horror inventions and reinvented them. Pretty cool.